Mark walked into his big house holding a $50,000 diamond bracelet. He was excited to surprise his fiancée, Sarah. But as he reached the door, he heard her laughing. It wasn't a sweet laugh. She was on the phone, telling a friend her real plan for Mark's money. What could she have said that was so bad it made a billionaire decide to destroy his own life by morning? Mark didn't scream. He didn't even open the door. Instead, he made a secret plan to lose everything. By the next day, the news said he was completely broke. His expensive cars and rich friends vanished instantly. He wanted to see if Sarah would stay when the money was gone. But as his world went dark, the person who surprised him most wasn't his fiancée. It was the maid, who started working 3 jobs just to buy him a bowl of soup. Why would a woman who barely knew him sacrifice everything for a failed man? And what exactly did Sarah say behind his back that started this whole mess? This is a story about a secret test that went further than anyone expected. Watch until the end to see the moment the truth finally comes out. This story teaches you the truth about trust, kindness, and how to judge one's character. So stick with us. Subscribe, like, share, and please tell us where you are watching from in the comments, as it means a lot to us. Mark stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office, watching the sun dip below the jagged horizon of the city. From this height, the world looked like a sprawling blueprint he had finally brought to life. The glass and steel structures below were more than just buildings. They were monuments to a decade of sleepless nights, high-stakes negotiations, and a relentless drive that had transformed him from a penniless student into the city's most formidable developer. He had spent his life pouring concrete into the earth and reaching for the clouds, but today, his mind wasn't on his next skyscraper. It was on a small, velvet-lined box sitting on his mahogany desk. "Is it to your satisfaction, sir?" Mark turned to face the jeweler, a quiet man who had waited patiently for the past 20 minutes. Mark picked up the box. Inside lay a diamond bracelet, its stones catching the dying sunlight and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. It had cost him $50,000, a sum that could have funded a small housing project. But Mark didn't blink. "It's perfect," Mark said, his voice deep and steady. "She deserves the best." To Mark, Sarah was the crowning achievement of his life. He had met her 3 years ago, just as his company was transitioning from successful to legendary. In his eyes, Sarah was the only thing in his world that wasn't a business transaction. She was soft where he was hard. She was playful where he was calculated. While he spent his days obsessing over profit margins and structural integrity, she talked about art, travel, and the life they would build together. He saw her as his sanctuary, the person who loved the man, not the empire. After dismissing the jeweler, Mark gathered his things. He felt a rare sense of buoyancy as he walked through the quiet office floor. His staff had already headed home, leaving only the hum of the air conditioning and the distant city sounds. He took the private elevator down to the garage, his reflection in the polished chrome showing a man at the peak of his powers. He was 40, fit, and about to marry the woman of his dreams. He truly believed he had cracked the code to a perfect life. The drive home was a victory lap. He steered his luxury sedan through the winding roads of the upscale neighborhood where he had recently purchased a mansion. It was a sprawling estate with manicured lawns and a fountain that danced under soft spotlights. He had bought it specifically because Sarah had mentioned months ago how much she loved the colonial style. Every brick of that house was a testament to his devotion. As he pulled into the circular driveway, he noticed the lights were on in the main living room. A smile tugged at his lips. He imagined Sarah's face when he presented the bracelet. He imagined the wedding, only 3 weeks away, where he would stand before their friends and family and promise her the world. He felt a surge of pride. He had come from nothing, and now he was providing a life of absolute security and luxury for the woman he loved. He stepped out of the car, the evening air cool and still. The house was quiet, save for the muffled sound of a television somewhere in the distance. He let himself in through the heavy oak front doors, moving quietly. He wanted to catch her off guard, perhaps find her reading in the library or relaxing on the terrace. The foyer was grand, smelling of expensive lilies and the faint scent of Sarah's perfume. As he approached the living room, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. He stopped, ready to push it open and announce his arrival with a flourish, but a sound gave him pause. It was Sarah's voice. She was on the phone, her tone light and melodic, followed by a peal of laughter. It was a sound he usually loved, but something about the cadence felt off, sharper, colder than the voice she used with him. Mark stood frozen, the gift box heavy in his coat pocket. He didn't mean to eavesdrop. He was simply waiting for a gap in her conversation. But then he heard his own name, and the air in the hallway suddenly felt very thin. "Oh, please, Jane," Sarah's voice rang out, clear and mocking. "Do you really think I'd marry a man who talks about building foundations at dinner if he didn't have a bank account to match?" Mark's hand, which had been reaching for the door handle, dropped to his side. The perfect illusion he had spent years building began to tremble. The hallway, which only moments ago had felt like a grand entrance to his sanctuary, suddenly felt like a narrowing tunnel. Mark stood motionless, his fingers still hovering inches from the polished brass handle of the living room door. The velvet box in his coat pocket, once a symbol of his bright future, now felt like a heavy stone dragging him down. Inside the room, the laughter continued, a sharp, melodic sound that Mark realized he had never truly heard before. It wasn't the soft, supportive chuckle Sarah gave him when he made a joke over dinner. This was the sound of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "I'm serious, Jane," Sarah's voice rose, dripping with a casual cruelty that made Mark's skin crawl. The man is obsessed with concrete. Last night at dinner, he spent 20 minutes explaining the structural integrity of the new harbor project. I almost fell into my soup from sheer boredom. Mark felt a dull throb behind his eyes. He remembered that dinner. He had been excited, sharing the milestone of a project that would provide thousands of homes. He had thought she was looking at him with admiration. Now he realized she had been counting the seconds until he stopped talking. "But hey," Sarah continued, her tone shifting to one of cold calculation. "It's only 3 weeks. 3 weeks until the I do's, and then the paperwork is finalized. I've already had a quiet meeting with a lawyer. Not James, obviously, someone who doesn't know him. We've gone over the prenuptial loopholes. In this jurisdiction, once we're married, half of those foundations he loves so much become mine. I just have to play the part of the doting bride for a little while longer." A silence followed, likely Jane asking a question on the other end. "Love him?" Sarah laughed again, and this time the sound was jagged. "Jane, you don't love a bank account. You manage it. Mark is a means to an end. The private jets, the unlimited credit cards, the mansion. This house is the only thing about him that has any personality. Once the settlement is done, I'm going to live the life I actually want. No more 5 a.m. runs, no more talk of profit margins, and definitely no more Mark." Mark's legs felt weak. He stepped back, his heels clicking softly on the marble floor. He was a builder. He understood when a structure was compromised. He knew that when the foundation was cracked, the entire building was a liability. He had spent 3 years building a life with a woman who didn't exist. The Sarah he loved was a ghost, a character played by a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a profitable project. He retreated further into the shadows of the foyer, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wanted to burst through the door. He wanted to throw the $50,000 bracelet at her feet and demand she leave his house. But as he reached the heavy oak front doors, a different instinct took over. It was the same instinct that had saved him in a dozen boardrooms, the need for a strategy. If he threw her out now, she would walk away with whatever she could grab, playing the victim. If he married her, he would lose half of everything he had built for the last 20 years. He slipped out the front door and back into the cool evening air. The fountain in the driveway continued its rhythmic dance, indifferent to the fact that his world had just imploded. He got into his car, but he didn't start the engine. Instead, he pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking, a rare occurrence for a man who prided himself on his iron nerves. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the one name he trusted above all others. "James," Mark said when the call was answered. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual confidence. "Mark, it's late. Is everything okay with the wedding preparations?" James asked, his voice warm and steady. "No," Mark replied, staring at the darkened windows of his own home. "Everything is wrong. James, I need you to meet me at the office in an hour. We need to draft some documents." "Documents? For the merger?" "No," Mark said, his gaze hardening as he watched Sarah's silhouette move past the living room window. "For a test. I need to lose everything, James. I need the world to believe I'm bankrupt. By tomorrow morning, I want the news to say that Mark is a ruined man." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mark, what are you talking about? That could destroy your reputation." "My reputation is built on stone and steel, James. It can survive a few headlines," Mark said, his voice regaining its strength, though it was now edged with a dangerous coldness. What I can't survive is a life built on a lie. I need to know if there's anyone in my life who sees the man behind the money. And I'm going to start with Sarah. Mark started the car, the engine purring like a caged beast. He backed out of the driveway without looking back, leaving the perfect illusion behind in the rearview mirror. The crack in the glass had formed, and now he was going to see just how quickly the whole house of cards would fall. The glass elevator ascended in a silent, pressurized blur, mirroring the rising pressure in Mark's chest. Usually, this ride was a moment of zen, a transition from the chaotic street level to the controlled sanctuary of his executive suite. Tonight, it felt like being trapped in a transparent coffin. As the doors slid open, the office was a graveyard of shadows, illuminated only by the rhythmic pulsing of the security panels and the distant, cold glow of the city skyline. James was already there, leaning against the edge of Mark's mahogany desk, a cardboard tray of coffees beside him. He looked every bit the seasoned litigator, expensive suit slightly rumpled, eyes sharp despite the hour. "You sounded like a man standing on a ledge, Mark," James said, his voice low and concerned. "What's happened? Is it the North Ridge project? Did the city council pull the zoning?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, staring at the reflection of his own face in the dark glass. He looked older. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, carved by the words he'd heard an hour ago. "I heard her, James," Mark said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I heard Sarah. She was talking to Jane. She didn't know I was home." As Mark recounted the conversation, the mockery of his passion for his work, the cold calculation of the prenuptial loopholes, the management of his bank account, James's expression shifted from concern to a grim, professional stillness. When Mark finished, the silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city's ventilation. "I'm sorry, Mark," James said softly. "Truly. But if this is the case, the solution is simple. We cancel the wedding tomorrow. We've got 3 weeks. It'll be messy, and she might try to sue for some sort of breach or emotional distress, but I can handle her." Mark turned around, his eyes burning with a sudden, dark intensity. "No. If I just cancel it, she'll play the victim. She'll spin a story to our friends, to the press, and she'll walk away looking for her next target. I don't just want to end it, James. I want to see if there is a single shred of the woman I thought I loved inside her. I want a stress test." James frowned. "A stress test? Mark, this isn't a bridge design." "Isn't it?" Mark stepped closer, his hands gesturing to the empty office. "Everything here is built on the idea that the foundation can hold the weight. Sarah is the person I was going to trust with my life. I need to know what happens when the weight of the world comes down on us. If she stays when I have nothing, then maybe I heard her wrong. But if she runs..." "You want to fake a bankruptcy," James summarized, rubbing his temples. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? If the SEC or the banks think you're actually insolvent, your stock will crater. Your creditors will circle like sharks." "We won't file anything official with the courts," Mark countered, his mind working with the clinical precision he used to solve structural failures. "We'll create the appearance of a collapse. I want documents, James. I want notices of foreclosure on the mansion. I want letters from banks stating my accounts are frozen due to an investigation into the North Ridge project. I want a press release ready for a leaked story about my company's total insolvency." James sighed, but he was already reaching for his laptop. He knew Mark. Once the architect had a blueprint, there was no stopping the construction. It'll have to look perfect. If there's even one typo, one legal inconsistency, she'll see through it. She's smarter than you give her credit for. "I know exactly how smart she is now," Mark said grimly. For the next 5 hours, the two men worked in the blue light of the computer screens. They drafted letters on forged bank letterheads, created a timeline of bad investments, and prepared a narrative of a sudden, catastrophic financial ruin. Mark felt a strange, detached sensation as he watched his life's work being dismantled on paper. It was a controlled demolition of his own reputation. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the windows, James hit print on a final stack of documents. The printer whirred, spitting out the evidence of Mark's manufactured downfall. "There it is," James said, sliding a folder across the desk. "The end of Mark the Millionaire. You sure about this? Once this bell is rung, you can't unring it." Mark picked up a notice of seizure for his home. He thought of the $50,000 bracelet still sitting in his pocket, a gift for a woman who didn't exist. "The foundation is already cracked, James," Mark said, standing up. I'm just clearing away the rubble to see what's left. The morning light was gray and unforgiving as Mark stepped out of the office building, the heavy folder from James tucked under his arm like a death warrant. He hadn't slept, but the adrenaline of his own destruction kept him upright. At exactly 7 a.m., James had sent the leaked internal memo to a contact at a major business blog. By 7:30 a.m., as Mark sat in his car, his phone began to vibrate. It didn't stop for the next hour. Mark's empire crumbles. Leaked documents suggest total insolvency. North Ridge project collapses amid financial probe. The headlines were a masterclass in panic. Mark watched the digital world turn on him with breathtaking speed. Business partners who had called him brother, the week before sent brief, formal texts postponing their scheduled meetings indefinitely. Friends who had begged for invitations to his wedding suddenly had urgent family matters that required them to pull out of the guest list. The social hierarchy of the city was a delicate ecosystem, and Mark was no longer at the top of the food chain. He was a carcass, and the scavengers were already retreating to avoid the scent of failure. He pulled into his driveway at 8:45 a.m. The mansion, which had always felt like a fortress of success, now looked like a stage set waiting to be struck. He walked through the front doors, the silence of the foyer ringing in his ears. He found Sarah in the breakfast nook, her face illuminated by the harsh glow of her tablet. She didn't look up when he entered. She didn't offer a good morning or a kiss. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of the warmth she had perfected over the last 3 years. Mark sank into the chair opposite her, allowing the genuine exhaustion of the night to pool in his eyes. He placed the folder on the table between them. "The North Ridge project, there were complications, Sarah. The bank pulled the funding, and it triggered a cross-default on my other holdings. James is trying to find a way out, but for now," he paused, letting his voice crack. "Everything is frozen. They're seizing the house on Monday." He watched her closely, hoping for a flicker of the woman he had loved. He waited for her to reach across the table and take his hand. He waited for her to say, "We'll figure it out together, or I don't care about the house, I care about you." Instead, Sarah slammed the tablet onto the marble countertop. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Monday?" she shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of pure vitriol. "The wedding is in 3 weeks, Mark. The deposits are paid, the guests are booked, and the house was supposed to be the venue for the reception. How could you be so incredibly stupid?" Mark blinked, taken aback by the sheer velocity of her anger. "Sarah, I've lost my life's work. I'm worried about where we're going to live, not the reception flowers. Where we are going to live." She stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. "There is no we in a tent, Mark. I have a reputation to maintain. I've spent months telling everyone about the life we were going to have, and now you're telling me I'm going to be the laughingstock of the city? The bride of the bankrupt builder? I thought you loved me," Mark said quietly, his heart hardening with every word she spat. "I loved the man you were supposed to be," she countered, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "I loved the man who could provide security and status. This version of you? This failure? He's nothing to me. You've lied to me, Mark. You've wasted my time." She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't ask if he needed a lawyer or a friend. She simply turned and marched toward the stairs. "I'm going to Jane's. I can't even look at you right now. I need to think about my options." "Your options?" Mark called after her. "Yes, Mark. Unlike you, I don't plan on going down with a sinking ship." 20 minutes later, the front door slammed with a finality that shook the foyer. Sarah was gone, her luxury SUV roaring down the driveway. Mark sat in the quiet breakfast nook, the $50,000 diamond bracelet still in his pocket, forgotten. The stress test had barely begun, and the structure had already collapsed. He was alone in a house that was no longer a home, but as he stared at the folder of lies, he felt a strange, cold sense of relief. The illusion was dead. Now he just had to see what remained in the rubble. He heard a soft sound from the kitchen, the clink of a ceramic cup. He had forgotten there was one more person in the house. He had almost forgotten about Anna. She had been with him for 2 years, a quiet, efficient presence who kept the gears of the mansion turning without ever drawing attention to herself. While Sarah had spent her days at spas and high-end boutiques, Anna had been the one who knew exactly how he liked his coffee and which flowers he was allergic to. "Sir?" Mark looked up. Anna was standing by the arched doorway, holding a tray with a fresh pot of coffee and a single piece of toast. She looked smaller than Sarah, dressed in her simple work uniform, her dark hair pulled back neatly. But her eyes were different. There was no calculation in them, only a steady, grounded concern. "I made some coffee, Mr. Mark," she said, her voice a calm contrast to the screaming match that had just echoed through the halls. "You haven't slept. You need to eat something." Mark sighed, rubbing his face with his palms. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. He was playing a game, a necessary one, he told himself, but for Anna, this bankruptcy would be a life-altering disaster. She relied on this paycheck to support herself and her mother, Mrs. Miller, who struggled with a chronic illness. "Anna, sit down for a moment," Mark said, gesturing to the chair Sarah had just vacated. Anna hesitated, the tray hovering in the air, then sat on the very edge of the seat. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her posture respectful, but her gaze unwavering. "I suppose you heard the news," Mark began, his voice heavy with a simulated defeat that was starting to feel exhausting. "And you definitely heard Sarah. The company, it's in a bad way. The bank is freezing everything. I'm going to have to let you go, Anna. I can't pay your salary anymore. In fact, I'm not sure I can even pay you for this week right now." He waited for the flash of panic he had seen in Sarah. He waited for her to ask about her final check, to start looking at her phone for new job listings, or to show the same resentment Sarah had. Instead, Anna did something that caught him completely off guard. She reached out and pushed the tray closer to him. "I'm not leaving, sir," she said firmly. Mark blinked, leaning back. "Anna, you don't understand. I'm broke. The house will be gone by Monday. You need to find a new job immediately. Your mother needs her medicine, doesn't she? You can't afford to be here for free." Anna nodded slowly, a sad but resolute smile touching her lips. "My mother is doing much better because of you, Mr. Mark. Do you remember 2 years ago? When I first started here?" Mark frowned, trying to recall. He remembered her being diligent from day one, but the details of her hiring were a blur of meetings and contracts. "My mother had that heart scare," Anna continued, her voice soft. "I was terrified. I didn't have the insurance, and the hospital was demanding a deposit I didn't have. I came to you, trembling, ready to ask for an advance on my pay. Before I could even finish the sentence, you had called your office. You told the hospital to send the bill to you. You didn't just give me an advance, you gave my mother a second chance at life." Mark remembered now. It had been a small thing to him at the time. A few phone calls and a check that barely registered on his balance sheet. To him, it was just the right thing to do for an employee. "You didn't treat me like a servant that day," Anna said, her eyes glistening. "You sat with me in that waiting room for an hour because you knew I had no one else to wait with. So, if you think I'm going to walk out that door just because the money stopped, you don't know me very well. I have some savings. Not much, but enough for groceries. I'll keep this house clean until they lock the doors, and I'll make sure you're fed. We'll figure the rest out." Mark felt a lump in his throat that was entirely real. He had spent millions trying to buy loyalty and love from Sarah, only for her to flee at the first sign of a storm. And here, in the quietest corner of his home, was a loyalty that money couldn't touch. "Anna, I can't ask you to do that," Mark whispered. "You didn't ask," she replied, picking up the empty tray. "I'm choosing to. Now please eat your toast. I'm going to go start on the laundry. There's no reason for you to wear a wrinkled shirt just because the banks are being difficult." As she walked back into the kitchen, the mansion didn't feel quite so empty. The day the world ended had taken his fiancée and his pride, but it had left him with something far more structural: the truth. The test was working, but the results were revealing a heart he had overlooked for far too long. The shadows in the grand dining room seemed to grow longer and heavier with each passing hour. To maintain the illusion of his downfall, Mark had stopped using the central heating and kept the lights dimmed to a minimum, claiming he couldn't afford the utility bills. The vast mansion, once a symbol of his soaring ambition, now felt like a cold, hollow shell. He sat at the long mahogany table, the same table where Sarah had once complained that the vintage wine wasn't chilled to the exact degree, and stared into the darkness. He heard the heavy thud of the front door closing, followed by the sound of keys rattling in a bowl. It was late, nearly 10 p.m. Anna had been gone since the early afternoon, and for a moment, Mark had felt a pang of worry. Perhaps the reality of his situation had finally set in, and she had quietly decided to move on. He couldn't have blamed her. But then, the familiar, soft rhythm of her footsteps approached the dining room. When she entered, she wasn't wearing her usual crisp uniform. Instead, she was dressed in a worn, oversized cardigan, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She was carrying a plastic bag that crinkled in the silence. "I'm sorry I'm late, Mr. Mark," she said, her voice a tired rasp. "The bus service is slower this time of night." She moved toward the kitchen and returned a few minutes later with a steaming bowl of soup and 2 thick slices of bread. The aroma was simple: carrots, potatoes, and broth, but in the chilled air of the house, it felt like a luxury. "Eat this while it's hot," she insisted, placing it before him. "It'll help with the cold." Mark picked up the spoon, but his gaze remained on her. He noticed a faint, greasy scent clinging to her hair and a small, rectangular name tag peeking out from her cardigan pocket. It was blue and white, with the words "The Corner Diner" printed in bold letters. "Anna," Mark said, his voice low. "Where have you been? And where did this food come from? I told you, I don't have the cash to reimburse you right now." Anna busied herself with straightening the placemats, avoiding his eyes. "Don't worry about that, sir. A friend of mine works at a grocery store. They had some items that were going to be tossed. And the soup, well, the diner lets us take home the leftovers from the lunch rush." Mark set the spoon down. The soup felt like lead in his stomach. "The diner? Anna, look at me." She finally looked up, and the sheer fatigue etched into her features hit him like a physical blow. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of light could hide. "You took another job," Mark stated. "It wasn't a question." Anna sighed, her shoulders slumping just an inch. "I had to, Mr. Mark. My mother's medication is expensive, and since the banks froze your accounts, I needed a way to keep the pantry full here. I work the breakfast and lunch shifts at the diner from 6 a.m. until 2 p.m. Then I come here to check on the house and you." Mark stared at her, horrified. "That's 8 hours on your feet before you even get here. And you're just getting home now at 10 p.m.? Where were you for the last 6 hours? Anna hesitated, then whispered. "I found a night crew position, cleaning the downtown office towers. It's quiet work, and it pays well because nobody wants the late shift. I do that 3 nights a week." Mark stood up so abruptly his chair scraped harshly against the floor. "Anna, stop. You are killing yourself for a man who can't even pay your bus fare. You're working 3 jobs? The diner, this house, and the night shift? When do you sleep?" "I sleep on the bus," she said with a small, defiant smile. "And I sleep well knowing my mother has her pills and you have a hot meal. You stood by us when we were drowning, Mr. Mark. You didn't count the cost back then. Why should I count it now?" Mark turned away, walking toward the window to hide the moisture stinging his eyes. He felt like a monster. His stress test was supposed to expose a villain, but instead, it was martyring a saint. He wanted to tell her right then, to pull out his phone, call James, and end the charade. He wanted to tell her that his bank accounts were overflowing, that her mother would never want for anything again, and that she could quit every one of those jobs tonight. But he thought of Sarah, safe and warm at Jane's house, probably plotting her next move to scrub him from her life. He needed to see this through to the end, for his own sake and for the sake of the truth. "You're a good person, Anna," Mark said, his back still turned to her. "Better than I ever deserved." "We're just people, Mr. Mark," she replied softly, picking up the empty tray. "Money only changes the clothes we wear, not the heart inside. Now finish your soup. I have to be up in 4 hours for the breakfast rush." As she walked away, Mark didn't feel like a powerful architect or a brilliant businessman. He felt small. He realized that while he had spent his life building skyscrapers to touch the clouds, he had completely missed the strength of the person standing right beside him on the ground. The morning light was a cold, thin gray as Mark stood by the darkened window of his library, watching a figure disappear down the long, winding driveway. It was 5:30 a.m. Anna was walking toward the bus stop, her shoulders hunched against the morning chill, her steps heavy with the exhaustion of a woman who had worked 3 jobs and slept for only 4 hours. Mark clutched a lukewarm mug of black coffee, his knuckles white. The guilt was a physical weight in his chest. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run after her, to pull her back into the warmth, and to tell her that the ruined man she was killing herself for was actually a multimillionaire. But the architect in him knew that a bridge couldn't be certified until it had endured the full weight of the storm. His phone buzzed on the desk, a jarring, mechanical sound in the stillness of the house. It wasn't James, and it wasn't Sarah. It was a number he recognized but rarely saw on his screen, Jane. He hesitated, then swiped to answer. "Jane! Mark!" she whispered, her voice sounding hurried, as if she were hiding in a closet. "I shouldn't be calling you. Sarah would kill me if she knew." Mark leaned against the cold mahogany of his desk. I thought you two were inseparable. Why the change of heart? I've been watching her, Mark, Jane said, her voice trembling slightly. And then I saw Anna. I saw her at the diner yesterday afternoon while Sarah and I were having lunch across the street. She looked like a ghost, Mark. And Sarah just laughed. She called it poetic justice, that your little servant was finally learning the value of $1. Mark felt a cold, sharp anger radiate from his spine. What do you want, Jane? I wanted to tell you the truth, Jane said. Sarah isn't thinking about us, Mark. She isn't staying with me because she's grieving our relationship. She's already moved on. She's been seeing a man named Paul for the last week. Paul? Mark searched his memory. The senior banker at the city's central firm? The very one, Jane confirmed. He's wealthy, he's stable. And most importantly to Sarah, his reputation is untarnished by bankruptcy. But that's not the worst part, Mark. She's telling everyone, Paul, our friends, the club members, that you and she broke up 6 months ago. She's saying you became secretive, unstable, and that she ended things because she couldn't handle your dark moods. She's rewriting your entire history to make sure no one thinks she's a gold digger who ran away when the money dried up. The silence on Mark's end was absolute. He looked at the $50,000 diamond bracelet still sitting in his desk drawer, the light catching its facets even in the dim room. Sarah wasn't just abandoning him, she was erasing him. She was painting him as a villain to protect her social standing, all while Anna, the woman who actually owed him nothing, was scrubbing floors in the middle of the night to keep him fed. She's already planning a gala appearance with him for next weekend, Jane continued. She wants to make it official so she can step into his world before your stink of failure, as she called it, ruins her chances. Thank you, Jane, Mark said, his voice dropping to a level of calm that was more terrifying than a shout. I appreciate you telling me. Are you going to be okay, Mark? I mean, the money, is it really all gone? Mark looked out at the sunrise, the orange light finally breaking through the gray. Money comes and goes, Jane, but foundations stay. I'm finding out exactly what mine is made of. After he hung up, Mark didn't feel the crushing sadness he had expected. Instead, he felt a strange, crystalline clarity. The stress test was over. He didn't need any more data. He knew who Sarah was, and he knew who Anna was. He picked up the folder James had given him, the papers that detailed the seizure of his home. He looked at the date. Monday. He sat down and began to write a list. It wasn't a list of bad investments or legal defenses. It was a list of names. Sarah, Paul, Anna, Mrs. Miller. He pulled out his phone and dialed James. It's time for the final phase, Mark said when his lawyer answered. I want to invite Sarah and her new friend to a meeting. Tell them it's to finalize the dissolution of assets. Tell them it's their last chance to claim anything from the estate before the banks lock the doors. And what about Anna? James asked. Mark watched the bus pull away from the stop at the end of the road, carrying the most loyal person he had ever known to her second job of the day. Anna is going to get a surprise, Mark said softly. But first, I have a house of cards to knock down. The following afternoon, the silence of the mansion was broken by the sound of the back door clicking open. Mark stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching as Anna practically stumbled into the kitchen. She didn't see him. She leaned against the counter, her head hanging low, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. She looked like a marathon runner who had gone 10 miles past her limit. She moved with painful slowness, her hands trembling as she reached for a glass of water. Mark noticed a dark bruise on her forearm, probably from bumping into a table during her frantic shift at the diner. She had been awake for nearly 20 hours. Anna, he said softly. She jumped, nearly dropping the glass. Oh, Mr. Mark. You startled me. I was just going to start on the floors before I headed to the offices. Mark walked into the light of the kitchen. You're not doing the floors. And you're not going to the offices tonight. You can barely stand. I'm fine, sir, she insisted, though her knees buckled slightly. She forced a smile that didn't reach her hollow eyes. Just a long lunch rush. They're impatient when they're hungry. But look, I brought you a sandwich. It's turkey. Fresh. She pulled a crushed paper bag from her pocket. It was a humble offering, bought with pennies she had earned while being barked at by strangers. Mark looked at the bag, then at the woman who had spent her last ounce of strength to bring it to him. In that moment, the contrast hit him with the force of a tidal wave. For 3 years, Sarah had claimed to love him. She had stood in the glow of his success, basking in the shadow he cast as a giant of industry. She loved the Mark, that was printed on checks and etched into granite. She loved his shadow. But Anna? Anna was here in the dark. She was here when the shadow had vanished, caring for the soul of the man who remained. She didn't care about the architect. She cared about the person who had once been kind to her mother. His phone chimed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Sarah's name on the screen. He looked at Anna, then at the phone. "I have to take this," Mark said. "Of course, sir," Anna whispered, already reaching for a sponge to wipe a counter that was already clean. Mark stepped into the library and answered. "Sarah." "Mark," she said, her voice brittle and impatient. "We need to meet. Formally. I've had some time to think, and I think it's best if we settle our affairs before the bank locks you out of that house. I don't want any of my personal property caught up in your legal mess." "I understand," Mark said, his voice as flat as hers. "Meet me at the downtown cafe at 3 o'clock. And Mark, don't be late. I have an appointment afterward. Also, I'm bringing a friend. A witness, really. To make sure everything is handled professionally." "I'll be there," Mark replied. He hung up and went back to the kitchen. Anna was leaning against the sink, her eyes closed for just a second. "Anna," Mark said, "I'm going out for a few hours. I want you to go upstairs to the guest room and sleep. That's an order. If I see you with a sponge when I get back, I'll be very disappointed." Anna looked at him, confused but too tired to argue. "Yes, Mr. Mark. If you're sure." Mark changed into a simple, worn shirt and a pair of jeans he had bought at a local store days ago. He wanted to look the part of the man Sarah thought he was, a broken, discarded remnant of a former life. The downtown cafe was an upscale spot, the kind of place where the chairs were velvet and the coffee cost $10. Mark arrived at 3 o'clock sharp. He saw Sarah immediately, seated at a corner table. She was dressed in a designer silk dress that probably cost more than Anna earned in 6 months. And she wasn't alone. Sitting next to her was Paul. He was exactly what Mark used to be, polished, arrogant, and draped in a suit that screamed old money. He held Sarah's hand on the table, his thumb stroking her knuckles in a way that felt possessive and rehearsed. As Mark approached, Sarah didn't look up with pity or even regret. She looked up with a smirk of triumph, as if she were showing off a brand new car to a neighbor she had always disliked. "Mark," she said, gesturing to the empty chair across from them. "Thank you for coming. I believe you know Paul." Paul didn't stand. He simply gave a curt nod, his eyes scanning Mark's cheap clothes with visible disdain. "Tough break, Mark. I heard about the North Ridge project. Real shame." Mark sat down, the $50,000 bracelet still heavy in his pocket. He looked at Sarah, then at the man she had chosen as his upgrade. The rehearsal was over. The final performance was about to begin. The velvet chair felt like a witness stand. Across the table, Sarah leaned back, her designer silk dress shimmering under the cafe's recessed lighting. She looked at Mark's worn shirt and jeans with a curl of her lip, her expression one of pure, unadulterated distaste. "I won't take much of your time, Mark," Sarah said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. "This is a formal release. It states that I have no liability for your debts, and in exchange, I'm waiving any claim to the personal items I left at the mansion. Not that the banks would leave anything worth having." Paul, sitting beside her, didn't even look at the paper. He was busy checking his gold watch, his thumb still stroking Sarah's hand with a smug, proprietary air. "It's for the best, Mark. In my business, we call this cutting your losses. Sarah deserves a certain caliber of life. One that a man in your position simply can't provide anymore." Mark looked at the paper, then at the woman he had intended to spend his life with. "So that's it? 3 years of our lives, and it ends with a liability waiver in a coffee shop." Sarah let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Don't be sentimental, Mark. It's pathetic. You're nothing without your money. You were always just an ordinary man who happened to be standing on a pile of cash. Now that the pile has vanished, there's nothing left to look at. You're boring, you're broken, and quite frankly, you're an embarrassment." Mark's gaze shifted to Paul. "And you, Paul? You're comfortable with this? Dating a woman who was picking out wedding flowers for our ceremony just 2 weeks ago." Paul's hand stopped moving. He frowned, looking from Mark to Sarah. 2 weeks. Sarah told me you two broke up last year. She said you'd been pestering her for months to come back." "Last year?" Mark allowed a small, cold smile to touch his lips. "Paul, she was living in my house until 5 days ago. She moved her things out the morning after the bankruptcy news broke. We were supposed to be married in 20 days. Paul pulled his hand away from Sarah's as if her skin had turned to ice. Sarah? What is he talking about? Sarah's face turned a blotchy, angry red. He's lying, Paul. He's just bitter and trying to ruin my reputation because I found someone better. He's a failed businessman with nothing left but his spite. I have the security footage of you leaving the house with your suitcases on Tuesday morning, Sarah, Mark said calmly. And I have the phone logs from Jane, who feels quite guilty about your little overlap with Paul here. Paul stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. The patrons at the nearby tables turned to stare. I don't date liars, Sarah. And I certainly don't date women who use me as a lifeboat while they're still wearing another man's ring. He looked at Mark with a strange flash of respect. You're lucky the money went, man. It saved you from a lifetime of this. With a sharp turn, Paul walked out of the cafe, leaving Sarah sitting in stunned silence. For a moment, she looked like she might cry, but the sadness quickly turned back into rage. She leaned across the table, her voice a hissed venom. Look what you did. You ruined everything. I hope you enjoy your tiny apartment and your cheap life, Mark. Because no woman of any status will ever look at a loser like you again. Mark didn't flinch. He sat up straighter, the slumped, defeated posture he had been wearing for days vanishing instantly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing a number on speaker. James, Mark said, release the correction to the press. And tell the Northridge foreman we're breaking ground on the second tower tomorrow morning. The audit is complete. Sarah froze. The audit. James's voice came through the speaker, crisp and professional. Everything is ready, Mark. The banks have already issued the apologies for the administrative error. Your accounts are fully restored. Shall I send the car to the cafe? Yes, Mark said. And James? Send a courier to the mansion. I have a $50,000 diamond bracelet that needs to be returned to the jeweler. I no longer have a use for it. Mark hung up and looked at Sarah. The blood had completely drained from her face. She looked at his worn shirt, then at his eyes, which were now cold, bright, and brimming with the power she had thought he'd lost. You lied, she whispered. I didn't lie, Sarah, Mark said, standing up. I built a stress test. I wanted to see if the woman I loved was as strong as the buildings I build. It turns out you were just a facade. You were right about one thing, though. Money changes the clothes we wear. But as it turns out, it's the only thing you ever cared about. I'm still the man I was. But you? You're just a woman who realized too late that she traded a diamond for a piece of glass. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving her sitting alone at the table, clutching a liability waiver that was now worth nothing at all. The black executive sedan idling outside the cafe was a silent, sleek animal in the afternoon sun. As Mark stepped into the back seat, the driver, his regular chauffeur who had been on leave during the charade, nodded respectfully. The interior smelled of expensive leather and air-conditioned stillness, a stark contrast to the humid, bitter atmosphere Sarah had left behind at the corner table. Mark leaned back and closed his eyes. The stress test was complete, the demolition was over, and it was finally time to build something real. When the car pulled into the mansion's circular driveway, Mark noticed the house looked different. The lights were no longer dimmed to save pennies. The fountain was dancing again, and the front doors were thrown open to catch the late afternoon breeze. He found Anna in the library. She hadn't gone to sleep as he had ordered. Instead, she was meticulously organizing his architectural blueprints, her eyes heavy but her hands steady. Anna, Mark said softly. She jumped, nearly dropping a roll of vellum. Mr. Mark, you're back. You look different. She squinted at him, noticing the way he stood, shoulders back, chin high, the aura of the failed man completely vanished. And that car outside, did the bank let you keep it for the day? Mark walked over and gently took the blueprints from her tired hands. Anna, sit down. We need to talk. For the next 20 minutes, Mark laid out the truth. He told her about the phone call he had overheard, the controlled demolition of his reputation he had planned with James, and the documents that were nothing more than props in a play. As he spoke, Anna's expression moved from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to a quiet, stunned shock. It was all a test, she whispered, her voice trembling. The soup, the cleaning jobs, you were never broke? I was never broke in the bank, Anna, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. But I was bankrupt in my life. I was surrounded by people who loved the shadow I cast, but not the man I was. Except for you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh folder, one that didn't contain fake seizure notices. This is for you. And for Mrs. Miller. Anna opened the folder with shaking fingers. Inside were receipts for her mother's medical debts, marked paid in full. There were also enrollment papers for the city's top university, with a scholarship in Anna's name covering 4 years of tuition, housing, and expenses. Finally, there was a contract for a junior project manager position at Mark's firm, starting the day she graduated. "I can't accept this," Anna gasped, tears spilling over her lashes. "I didn't help you because I wanted a reward. I helped you because it was the right thing to do." "I know," Mark said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "That's exactly why you're the only person I want by my side as I move forward. You showed me that a home isn't built with bricks and mortar, Anna. It's built with character." While Mark and Anna began the work of transforming their lives, the world outside shifted with equal gravity. Sarah's fall from grace was swift and absolute. Within 48 hours of the news breaking that Mark's bankruptcy was a hoax, she was a social pariah. Paul's public rejection had labeled her a gold digger, and the wealthy circles she once inhabited closed their doors to her. She ended up in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the far edge of the city, working a mundane desk job where no one cared about her designer labels or her curated reputation. In her pursuit of security, she had traded a life of true abundance for a cold, lonely reality. 6 months later, Mark and Anna stood together in the lobby of a newly renovated community center. It was the headquarters for the True Foundation, a nonprofit they had launched together. Its mission was simple: providing education, healthcare, and job training to those who, like Anna and Mark once were, just needed a chance to prove their worth. Mark looked at Anna, who was now a confident student and a vital part of his team. She was no longer a quiet light in the shadows. She was a pillar of the community they were building together. "You ready?" Mark asked as the crowd gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Anna smiled, her eyes bright with a future she had earned 100 times over. "Ready, Mark. Let's build something that actually lasts." Mark realized then that while his skyscrapers might one day crumble, the legacy of kindness and loyalty they were building would remain, a foundation that no storm could ever shake. Mark's story isn't just about a fake bankruptcy or a $50,000 bracelet. It's a reminder that money only changes the clothes we wear, not the heart inside. Mark built skyscrapers that touched the clouds, but he almost missed the strongest foundation right in his own home. Sarah loved his shadow, the wealth, the status, and the power. But Anna loved his soul. She was willing to work 3 jobs and sleep on a bus just to make sure a ruined man had a warm meal. The truth is, we all have stress tests in our lives. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what is truly worth keeping. Before you go, I want you to think about this. If you lost every cent in your bank account today, who in your life would still be standing by your side tomorrow? Is your circle built on what you have, or who you are? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe, like, and share this video. It helps us tell more stories like this. And finally, please tell us where you are watching from in the comments. It truly means a lot to us to see our global family growing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.